Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. Our goal in this series is to provide parish staff, volunteers, and diocesan ministers the formation, training, and tools needed to create vibrant Catholic parishes and growing ministries. In today's webinar, Julia Dezelski will explore how pastoral leaders can implement both Christus Vivit and Amoris Laetitia to enrich their ministry with youth and families. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the Parish and Curriculum Marketing Specialist at Ave Maria Press. Before we begin our webinar, we'd like to recognize our webinar partners, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association of Catholic Family Life Ministers, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the Catholic Campus Ministry Association. Everyone in this audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions may be sent to our presenter using the question section of the GoToWebinar panel, which you can see displayed here, and I will ask as many of those questions as possible at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be sent to you later this week via email. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Julia Dezelski is Assistant Director for Marriage and Family Life at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. She holds a licentiate and doctorate in theology from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. While living in Rome for over 10 years, she ministered and worked with youth, young adults, families, and taught English to all age levels. She has written and spoken on the gift of life, motherhood, women in church and society, the domestic church, and liturgical life. Julia and her growing family live in the DC metro area. Julia, thank you for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Erin.
Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and pass the presenter mode over to you. Find my mouse here, and you can go ahead and take it away.
Excellent.
Okay, there we go. All right, I'm going to close out my webcam. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. Hello, everyone. As Erin said, I am Assistant Director at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Secretariat for Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth. And if you listened to last week's webinar, you would have heard my colleague, Paul Jarzembowski, another ski name, we have that in common in our secretariat, we're both skis, who presented on evangelization to young people through Ash Wednesday and Lent. And I really enjoyed his presentation. I'm sure you did as well. Now, my area of concern is marriage and family life. My work primarily concerns marriage and family life diocesan or parish directors across the country. And the purpose for this webinar today is to really help us start thinking about what the most recent post-synodal apostolic exhortation, Christus Vivit, means for our families and for those who work with them. So if you live in a cold area of this country like I do, in the Washington, D.C. area where it's sunny but freezing, grab your cup of tea. Hopefully it's still hot, and let's begin with just a short prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord God, we thank you for this opportunity to be together. Wherever we are gathered in your name, we are together here to speak about what we can do to further your glory through marriage and family, through the help of our Holy Father, Pope Francis, who has provided us with these excellent words in Christus Vivit. And we ask you to just enlighten our minds and our hearts today as we listen to these words, meditate on them, and think through them. Think about how they apply to our lives and how they apply to ministry in your church for your greater glory. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So in case you don't already know, Christus Vivit is a post-synodal apostolic exhortation, and it's directed to young people primarily. as well as to the entire people of God. And I hope you've all had the opportunity to read it. This webinar gave me the opportunity to read it a second time. And I would actually suggest that before we begin, maybe if you have a copy on hand, you can grab your copy. I'm going to grab mine, actually, my own copy of Christus Vivit, and maybe just go through the numbers with me. It just might be helpful to see where I'm referring to as I refer to the apostolic exhortation. Or you can pull it up, of course, online. It's on the Vatican website as well. So generally speaking, young people refers to the ages of 16 to 29. But what is the connection with families? And that's what we're going to get into today. The reason for our discussion on families today, sorry. There we go. So why families? Because all pastoral workers of any type and degree work to some extent with families. Whether you are a director of religious education, whether you're a school principal, a deacon, a catechist, a youth and young adult minister, or volunteer or maybe salaried, whether you're part-time or full-time, whatever the case may be, if you're listening to this webinar today, most likely you are serving the church in some capacity. And if you are serving the church in some capacity, then you are most likely serving her families. And those families are the domestic churches. And this is an important reminder. It serves us well to remember that the church is modeled on the family, and the family is really the first church. It's the first community of believers. As Pope Francis says, the church is a family of families. So for this reason, whenever papal documents or any form of statement is issued to the church, it does concern the family in some way or another. I might even say that the family is really the first audience, even regardless of the subject matter or particular audience that it might target, because the fact is really everything in some way affects the family. So what I'm offering today is, like I mentioned before, it's really like a meditation or a deep reading of Christus Vivit. I don't mean to introduce a study session. You don't have to take notes unless you wish to, but I do hope that it encourages you to ponder anew what Pope Francis is really saying to us, and specifically in reference to families, because like I said, families influence the church, and the church is directly influenced by the families. So whether you're a pastoral worker working alongside any member of a family, or maybe raising one yourself, or maybe even you're just a member of a family, and that's important too, and then this webinar is for you and all of the rest of you. So none of us really needs to studies or statistics to tell us what we already know, and that's namely that family is the foundation of society, or as Pope John Paul II said, and I love how he said this, as the family goes, so goes the nation, and so goes the whole world in which we live. But I do want to mention just one study, and I think this is really an important study that I'd encourage you to take a look at. It's the report on American Catholic religious parenting, which was actually done there at the University of Notre Dame by Christian Smith and Justin Bartkus. And again, this is also accessible online. I think you just have to sign up to receive a copy of it, and you can download it. It's a really good study on the state of American families and on the religiosity of young people today as a result of the religiosity or lack thereof in the family. So it tells you a lot about that connection between the family and young people, and how the family influences, especially the faith of young people. And so that's why I'd like to share with you some of the main findings of this study done by him. He says, of all actors, it is the parents who exert overwhelmingly the greatest influence upon the eventual religious views and commitments of American children. And, you know, there's a popular cliche that as children progress through adolescence and into adulthood, that parental influence recedes, that it recedes further and further into the background, ultimately declining to nil, right? As children embrace other influences of their own choosing. So on this account, maturing teenagers and young adults become utterly self-determining agents, immune to any ancestral influence. Well, studies show, well, at least Christian Smith's study showed that this is not true. And actually, we will soon see that Pope Francis agrees with Christian Smith and his studies. The crucial location, in fact, where youth's religious outcomes are largely decided is not the congregation or even the parish, but it's really the home. And this is all to say that the definitive causal agents and the religious and spiritual outcomes of American youth are neither clergy nor youth ministers, neither educators nor the voices of popular culture and media, but it's really the parents. And Christian Smith is also, I think, lead person on the National Study on Youth and Religion. He leads that effort. It may or may not have ended, but I did find its website. And there you can also find that many of their reports and conclusions all lead to this same conclusion, that parents were far and away the most powerful influence on the religious outcome of millennials. So I bring that up because although it might already be common knowledge maybe to a lot of us already in this sphere of the church working with youth and young adults, it's actually something that Pope Francis is going to repeat in Christus Vivit, and a little subtly. So that's why we're going to look today at how he says it and why he says it. So first, Christus Vivit is a message to and about families. So what does Christus Vivit really say to families? Well, actually, Pope Francis does not really speak directly to families, like we said before. He's speaking to young people. However, in speaking to young people, he does say a lot about families. He says a lot both directly and indirectly. Because whatever youth and young adults are experiencing today, and Christus Vivit mentions a lot of the scenarios that young people are facing today, they experience it sometimes because of their family of origin, and other times they are experiencing it simply with or without their families present in their lives. So what I mean by this is that they are experiencing life and the world around them either with the support of their families or not with the support of their families. And that's a big issue. So with or without the support of their families, they have a lot to process, to assimilate, to wade through. And sometimes they have no one at all to wade through all of life's stuff with. So we have to be aware of both of these realities. So let's look at what does Pope Francis then say about families exactly? He says that families are the bedrock of society and every other institution, which is why this message is for the young people of the world, and it's a message to and about families. Because young people are rooted in families, and young people are setting roots for their own families. So let's look at the first part. Young people are rooted in families. Pope Francis basically dedicates an entire chapter to the rootedness, so to speak, of young people, and that's chapter 6. So if you want to skip ahead to chapter 6, we're going to go right to the heart of the document together. And right at the outset, we look at the heart of the document because he's talking about this rootedness of young people, where their roots lie. And he says, think about it. He says, if someone tells young people to ignore their history, to reject the experiences of their elders, to look down on the past, and to look forward to a future that he holds out, doesn't it then become easy to drag them along so that they only do what he tells them? It sounds like Pope Francis is talking about someone kind of conniving in this passage. He says that he needs the young to be shallow, uprooted, and distrustful so that they can trust only in his promises and act according to his plans. And that is how Pope Francis continues. That's how various ideologies operate, because they destroy all differences so that they can reign unopposed. To do so, however, they need young people who have no use for history, who spurn the spiritual and human riches inherited from past generations, and are ignorant of everything that came before them. So this is one of the first issues that Pope Francis brings up. He brings up this problem of uprootedness, that young people are not experiencing their true roots. And hence they're lacking meaning. So he says, I encourage you to care for your roots. He said this in Panama. I encourage you, young people, to care for your roots, because from the roots comes the strength that is going to make you grow, to flourish, and to bear fruit. I love this image here of this older man with the child over his shoulder. I think this says actually a lot about what Pope Francis is trying to emphasize here. You can almost visualize in your mind the feet of this older man, probably standing in the midst of a crowd, maybe in a crowded, I don't know, restaurant area. But he is planted on solid ground, and he hoists this child up over his shoulder and is the root, in a sense, for this child. And so it's a very good visual of what Pope Francis is talking about here. Now, Pope Francis is not just talking about family as the roots of young people. He's also talking about the culture of one's origins, about the history of one's nation, and all the spiritual and human riches that are inherited from past generations. But family always takes a front seat in this. Family is always, if we can think of it in these terms, family is always the filter by which our culture, our nation, the spiritual and human riches that surround us, even in our schools, even in our parish and other institutions, are filtered through. The family is really that filter through which everything comes to young people. So from here, he proceeds to talk about the youth's relationship specifically with the elderly. And he says that at the synod they heard that the young are focused on the future and they face life with energy and dynamism. But they are also tempted to give little attention to the memory of the past from which they come, and in particular, those many gifts transmitted to them by their parents, their grandparents, and the cultural experience of the society in which they live. So we could ask ourselves, okay, so do young people, again in that range between 16 and 29, do they really pay little attention to the gifts they receive from their parents and grandparents? Maybe yes and no. You might all know in your lives some young people between these ages really well. They might be your own children. And you might say, well, you know, my child actually enjoys spending some time with grandpa when he comes around. Actually, here in my own household, we're getting ready for the visit of my in-laws. Grandparents that I haven't seen in 2 years. I haven't seen my in-laws in 2 years, but I have a toddler and a 2-month-old who are really going to, I hope, enjoy the experience of their grandparents, even though they're quite small still. But to answer the question about that age group of 16 to 29, we have to remember who, generally speaking, these young people are. Even maybe think back to what we were like at that age. First of all, they are teenagers, okay? And that's already saying a lot. They're teenagers on the cusp of adulthood. They're adolescents. They're seeking to understand who they are and how they fit into this world. But they might overlook the obvious. They are high schoolers who feel the pressures of their peers around them. They are the college undergraduates who are grappling with newfound freedoms and fears. They are graduate students who don't know how they're going to ever pay back their student loans. They may be even young couples who are starting out on an adventure of a lifetime. Or they're young singles looking still for that perfect person to step into their lives. So in general terms, we're talking about a large swath of people. And these young people are basically suspended. They're suspended between two habitats. On the one hand, they recognize as home in their family circle. They recognize the home of their family circle. But on the other hand, they are perceiving on the horizon already a new home and family circle. They're looking towards the future. So they kind of have 2 feet in 2 grounds, right? They've got 1 foot in their own home of origin that maybe they're trying to pull out. They've already got another foot firmly planted on the other side of the fence in a future home and family circle that they're trying to start. They're just tilling the soil now. They're just setting the compost. I mean, there's so much between those 2 feet, though, that's happening. And when I say that they've got one foot in their own home of origin and another foot in the future home and family circle, I'm not excluding, of course, the call to the priesthood and religious life, because in a very similar way to family life, the priesthood and religious life is a family. The priesthood calls you to be a father to the family of your parish and in your diocese. The religious life makes you partake of another family, a religious family. So it's all connected, and it's all a certain type of family. So the path between the one and the other, between that original family circle and that new family circle that one is creating, can be tortuous, and it can be terrifying. And that brings us to our second point. They're setting roots for their own families, and that requires a lot. Young people are navigating the waters between their family and their future family, for which they are putting down new roots, whatever that call may be. And Pope Francis recognizes the role that youth ministry plays in all this, that it plays particularly in this process. And he uses different imagery by saying that it can be compared to building a house on a rock, and that rock will be their own home and family one day. So he says this, he says, youth ministry then can present the ideal of life in Christ as the process of building a house on a rock. And for most young people, that house, their life, will be built on marriage and married love. Now, Pope Francis seems to follow the trajectory of the future, because the next section in this chapter is titled Dreams and Visions. So he recognizes that young people are dreamers, okay? They're stargazers because they are intentioned towards the future. But he also does something interesting. He speaks about the dreams of the elders before us that preceded us, that is, of our grandparents who preceded us, and also have dreams. And I thought that this was a really beautiful image. I don't know if you all caught it the first time around when you were reading Christus Vivit. I don't think I paid as much attention the first time as I did now, because he talks about how the elderly have dreams built up of memories and images that bear the mark of their long experience. And he says, if young people sink roots in those dreams, they can peer into the future. They can have visions that broaden their horizons and show them new paths. But if the elderly do not dream, young people lose clear sight of the horizon. Now those are just beautiful, beautiful words, and I didn't include them on the slide here, but that's number 193. So if you want to look that up or just earmark it, it's a beautiful way of thinking about how our ancestors have a place in our lives back before we had a place in their lives, meaning before we were alive, before they even knew us. Their dreams already were preparing for our dreams. And so I thought that was a beautiful image of how ancestry, of how our roots impact our lives, and so therefore the lives of young people. So he says, if young people sink roots in those dreams, so not just in their own dreams, he's asking them to think outside of their dreams, think outside of those usual bubbles in which especially young people tend to dream and to think. We all do it, but I think that young people especially feel within their own bubble of dreams, of ideals, of desires, of hopes, etc., etc. But if they were to sink their roots in the dreams of their elders, they can peer into the future and they can have visions that broaden their horizons and show them new paths. But he's also saying, not just to the young, put roots in those dreams, but he's also saying to the elderly, don't forget to dream. Don't forget maybe even to continue dreaming, even in your old age, because your dreams will influence your young people. It might sound a little bit idealistic or even a little dreamy, for lack of a better word, but these are all important things, because as he also explains in this chapter, it all started with the dream of God. And I think by dream, he's probably also referring to a sense of a plan. It all started with God's plan, with creation. It all started with his plan also for redemption. And what grandparent does not dream also for the young people in their lives to be redeemed of the relentless circle in which they find themselves, the grueling lives that sometimes entangle us. Our elders dream always for a better life than the ones that they might have lived, or just as good a life as they lived. So I think it's just beautiful, this whole imagery of the elders dreaming for the youth. I'm just thinking back to my own ancestry with grandparents on both sides of my family who laid down roots in a new country or a new part of the United States with a dream in their heart. This gives me a thrill of joy because it means they shaped history for me in some way. They started the dream. But it also means that I'm already shaping history and a dream for those who will follow me, for my own children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So perhaps our parents have preserved a memory that can help us imagine the dream our grandparents dreamed for us. And so he continues, all of us, even before our birth, received as a blessing from our grandparents a dream filled with love and hope, the dream of a better life. Even if not our grandparents, surely some of our great-grandparents had that happy dream as they contemplated their children and then grandchildren in the cradle. But the very first dream, like I mentioned before, is that of God our Father, which precedes and accompanies the lives of all his children. And the memory of this blessing that extends from generation to generation is a precious legacy that we should keep alive so that we too can pass it on. So that's the continuation of number 194. So anyway, I found this number to be particularly beautiful in Pope Francis's whole expose, basically, on the family. So Pope Francis launches this exhortation to the young and the old. He says, if we journey together, young and old, we can be firmly rooted in the present, and from here revisit the past and look to the future. So to revisit the past in order to learn from history and heal old wounds that at times still trouble us. To look at the future in order to nourish our enthusiasm, cause dreams to emerge, awaken prophecies, and enable hope to blossom. Together we can learn from one another, warm hearts, inspire minds with the light of the gospel, and lend new strength to our hands. So he's encouraging the youth and the elderly to walk together. But by elderly, he's not just talking about necessarily about the grandparents, about the real elders that we consider. He's also talking about the parents in their lives and any kind of mentor, an older figure who has in some sense a close rapport with these young people, who is in the lives of these young people and can guide them and can help them recognize perhaps how to learn even from their own mistakes in the past. So I think one of the important things that he's saying here about families, specifically about the older generations, whether they're parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, older aunts and uncles, or what have you, is that first of all, they are the foundation for young people. Second of all, they must walk together with young people. And here he initiates this idea of accompaniment. Or rather, he doesn't initiate it here, but he brings it up again here. And we all know that Pope Francis really puts a lot of emphasis on this concept of accompaniment. But this form of accompaniment, of families walking together, is key. It's key for us to remember. Basically, at the moment in which young people do want to be untethered, right, from home and family, and many times they literally are untethered. This exhortation, however, is reminding them and their families that the walk continues together, even through their young adulthood, even through adolescence and through maturity as a young adult, as they're finding that ground, as they're making that leap over the fence. So I said at the beginning that Christus Vivit doesn't say much directly to families, but here he's speaking directly to families. When he says, what can we elderly persons give to the young? He says, we can remind today's young people that a life without love is an error to life. So what can we tell them? He says, we can tell fearful young people that anxiety about the future can be overcome. He says, what can we teach them? We can teach these young people that there's more joy in giving than in receiving, and that love is not only shown in words, but also in actions. So helping the young to discover the living richness of the past, to treasure its memory and to make use of it for their choices and opportunities is really a genuine act of love towards them for the sake of their growth and the decisions they are called to make. So I've spent a lot of time on this section because Pope Francis spends a lot of time on this. He spends a lot of time on this message, which reminds me, it must be one of his priorities for this new year, because in just a few short weeks, he's actually convening a conference at the Vatican on elders and grandparents, which should be really interesting because it's because they are somewhat the forgotten people. So here we are in a document to the young people, and we're talking about elders and grandparents. It might seem ironic, but there's an interplay here that's very important. So our first takeaway, one of the first takeaways can be this: Pope Francis speaks about families as foundations and those founding members of families as key accompaniers to young people in their journey. Now you're probably thinking, I don't know if accompanier is a word. I don't either, but it is now. We're going to use accompanier because it sounded right. So the foundation is the family, right? And that's the first place of accompaniment. And the founding members are the first accompaniers. Excuse me. I'm going to grab a little more tea. It's now cold, but it does the trick. So later on, he states more explicitly, young people need to have their freedom respected, yet they also need to be accompanied, and the family should be that first place of accompaniment. And again, this is really key because with all that has been said about accompanying young people, I think that this really gets overlooked, and that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this webinar. The family is really the first place of accompaniment, and yet it seems maybe too obvious to state. But it has to be stated again and again because families are essential, and they're being uprooted. If young people are uprooted today, it's because the families are uprooted. And I'm not just talking literally, like some migrant families are uprooted, and that's in a very literal sense, which is also an issue. But families who have perhaps lived in the same home for two generations feel uprooted because for many reasons. It might be the society around us, it might be just that lack of connection between one another, but also lack of meaning. And so we'll get into that now. I don't want to jump too far ahead. But in chapter 6, he speaks optimistically of the promises that young people inherit, but he also looks at the flip side. And this flip side comes up in chapter 7. It's a completely different tone. It's that reality of loss and disillusionment. And here he speaks of this uprootedness of young people who need a family. And they are basically orphans. A lot of young people today are basically orphans of meaning and of history and of roots. And so he actually speaks of dreams again here. He talks about those young people who have inherited the failed dreams of their parents and grandparents, whether that's due to injustice or violence or some other form of oppression or tragedy. There are so many reasons, but I found it interesting that here in the next chapter, he speaks of these failed dreams, and young people are inheritors of these. So he says, we need to make all our institutions better equipped to be more welcoming to young people, since so many have a real sense of being orphaned. And he says, here I'm not referring to family problems, but to something experienced by everyone, by boys and girls, young people and adults, parents and children alike. Many young people today feel that they have inherited the failed dreams of their parents and grandparents. Dreams that are betrayed by injustice, by social violence, by selfishness, by a lack of concern, and in other words, they feel uprooted. And this experience of discontinuity, of uprootedness, and the collapse of fundamental certainties that is fostered by today's media culture creates a deep sense of orphanhood, to which we must respond, he says, by creating an attractive and fraternal environment where others can live with a sense of purpose. Again, beautiful words that tell us a little something about our own ministries and about the church. The solution is that the church must be that family where young people are coming to our churches without a family in the literal sense, but also without a sense of meaning and purpose because their own families, who might still gather around the dinner table, are lacking a sense of connectedness, of true communion, of faith, hope, and charity. Then where do they find it? If that domestic church is not really a home, then where do they go to find home? They find it in the church, in the bigger church. The church has to be that home where these young people find belonging and meaning. So in a word, and this is also another beautiful passage, in a word, to create a home is to create a family. It is to learn to feel connected to others by more than merely utilitarian and practical bonds. It's to be united in such a way as to feel that our life is a bit more human. To create a home is to let prophecy take flesh and make our hours and days less cold, less indifferent and anonymous. It's to create bonds by simple everyday acts that all of us can perform. But it demands that we all work together. No one can be indifferent or stand apart, since each is a stone needed to build the home. And this reminds me, of course, of St. Paul. We're all members of the one body in the institutional church, in the larger church. He's saying that that same image is transferred to the home, where each member of the family is a stone to build that home. So in reality, this paragraph paints the picture of what the domestic church should look like. But he asks us to use this image to paint a picture of the institutional church for young people. We have to show young people that the institutional church is a home. It is their family. In the following paragraph, he also describes that place. He says, let's provide young people with places they can make their own, where they can come and go freely, where they feel welcome and readily meet other young people in all times of their lives, in all seasons of their lives. That's what a home is. And he mentions that some of this already takes place in youth group ministries and oratories and youth centers. And many times they offer this relaxed ambiance in which they can find a place to be rooted. But the person-to-person contact is what is indispensable for passing on the message that these young people need. And it cannot be replaced by pastoral resources or strategies. And he says all of this in number 218. So he's really talking about a place that does sound like home. It does sound like a living room. It sounds like a kitchen table, or that kitchen island where mom is cooking dinner and everybody gathers around to see what she's cooking and peer into the bowl or taste some of the dough. This home environment is what he's talking about as being a place in the church. And here in the US, we may have a lot of these youth centers, so to speak, but it's worth asking ourselves, how do they really feel? And I also kind of think back to this question too. Do our youth centers, are they kind of homes that are meant to feel like home, but everybody knows it's not home, so it's never going to feel the same? And if that's the case, why don't we also bring our youth groups into other people's homes? Why don't we experience the families of other young people together as a youth group? I don't know if that's a practical difficulty, but getting to know one another's families so that every family is like another home, especially to those without those families. And just an idea that can maybe make that sense of church as home, as family, a little bit more real. So let's go to another point. So family is an image of the church. And this is really what young people seek. Young people need family, and hence they also need a church. And they need each other to be like the other. And I think that's kind of what I was trying to say just now. They need each to be like the other. So what does the church and the family do specifically when accompanying the youth, right? They are accompanying these young people towards self-fulfillment, or in other words, to the discovery of their vocation to holiness. And their vocation to holiness is usually fulfilled by a life of service. And Pope Francis knows that the majority of young people will live out this call to service through marriage and family life. He says young people intensely feel the call to love. They dream of meeting the right person with whom they can form a family and build a life together. He says this is undoubtedly a vocation which God himself makes known to them through their feelings, their desires, and dreams. So he's talking now he's moving beyond that family of origin, and now he's talking to, from that one side of the fence to the other side of the fence. He's talking about now that call to love. They all feel it intensely. They dream of meeting that right person with whom they can form a family and build a life together, or listen to God's call and respond to it, to a life of service in the church, more specifically as a consecrated person or as a priest. But since the family of origin is the foundation for the lives of these young people, their future choices are always impacted by it. So for this reason, if their families are hurt by divorce, by separation, by other types of conflicts, domestic violence, then the prospect of marriage as a hopeful possibility for them is much harder to believe in, and the Pope is aware of this. Francis recognizes that the wounds in many families can be the cause of a crisis of identity. And he writes, the family continues to be the principal point of reference for young people, regardless. It's always their principal point of reference. Children appreciate the love and care of their parents. Well, maybe not always, but ideally, they give importance to family bonds, and they hope to succeed in forming a family when it is their own time. He says, without a doubt, the increase of separation, of divorce, of second unions, of single-parent families, this is all a cause of great suffering, and it creates a crisis of identity in young people. And that is very real. This crisis of identity is real in a, I don't know how else to say, in a very real way today. And you will experience it if you work in a school, or if you work with these young people in your churches and your parishes. Young people are experiencing some crises of identity that really dig deep into their souls, and I believe that it's really founded in these issues of family life, and without the family as that stronghold, as that foundation, as that strong rock upon which their lives are built, then they don't know who they are anymore. And I think that's a lot of what we're experiencing today in our culture. But Pope Francis continues and says that sometimes they take on responsibilities that are just not proportioned to their age, or force them to become adults before their time. And then again, he gives recognition to the grandparents and says they are those wise people who take it upon themselves to make sure that they are a vital link in the relationship between generations. And they're also transmitting the faith. Studies have been done on this as well. The grandparents then are the ones who step in. We're the ones who are passing the patrimony, the faith, onto their children or to their grandchildren, because there's a break in the generations. There's a lack of transmission. So this crisis of identity, what does it do? It leads to another crisis. It leads to a crisis of vocation. And young people ask themselves, well, if I haven't witnessed the love between spouses that endures, how can I be certain that my love for someone will endure? If my family is wounded, how do I know that my future family won't be wounded? Is marriage really worth it? Is family life really worth it? If I've come from these roots, right, how can I be sure that I can lay down stronger roots, more vital roots? But Pope Francis says, of course it's still worth it. You have nothing to fear. And this is another point then. Forming a new family is a vocation of service, to which most youth will be called. However, those wounds inflicted upon families of origin create a crisis of identity and vocation in young people. So Pope Francis is aware of the reticence experienced by young people today to get married. Now, cohabitation has existed now for a number of decades, and it continues to be on the rise as it becomes just a way of life for most young people. And numerous factors do contribute to this. There's the rising living costs, unemployment, student debt. But these are all financial factors. The real crippling issues are the psychological, the mental, the emotional issues and stress factors that impact a growing number of young people who are raised in broken homes. These are the issues, the stress factors that are affecting a lot of their lives, and hence the choice to cohabitate rather than marry. And Pope Francis is aware of this trend. But he says that although these difficulties experienced in our own families can lead young people to ask whether it's worthwhile to start a new family, to be faithful, to be generous, he says, I can tell you, young people, with certainty, it is worth it. It is worth your every effort to invest in the family. There you will find the great incentives, the best incentives to mature, and the greatest joys to experience and share. So don't let yourselves be robbed of a great love. I think these are just beautiful words to share with young people today. Don't let yourselves be robbed of a great love. And he's kind of speaking in financial terms that are going to make sense to people. Invest. He's saying invest in the family. And then he says, don't be robbed of a great love. So invest in what really matters. Invest in that real treasure, the real treasure that's going to bring forth an amazing fruitful harvest of all good things that truly our souls yearn for. So there are also societal and cultural trends of which Pope Francis speaks, and he talks of that culture of the ephemeral that dominates. But he says that's just an illusion. He says nothing can be definitive, or rather to think that nothing can be definitive is just a lie. He says, today there are those who say that marriage is out of fashion, but he says, many preach the importance of enjoying the present moment. He says, I say instead, enjoy a lifelong commitment. Make a definitive decision. He says, be revolutionaries. Swim against the tide. Do what other people aren't doing and get married. Get married in the church. Let God bless your marriage and let it be forever, because this is what we're truly made for. We're made for that communion that endures forever. So here it is. Here's a beautiful image of what that marriage looks like. He says, yes, I'm asking you to rebel against this culture that sees everything as temporary and that ultimately believes you are incapable of responsibility, incapable of true love. He says, but I have great confidence in you. I know that you are capable. I know that you can do it, even despite all of the odds against you, even if you do come from a broken home, a broken family, a broken marriage. You are capable of tilling new soil, of planting new seeds, of growing a new harvest. So by encouraging them to make the leap into marriage without fear, trusting that they are capable of a great love, he's at the same time reminding them that the lay vocation to which most of us are called is directed to express charity that starts within the family. And I found this to be really insightful, and I found it interesting that he would put it in here. But he's saying, don't forget, young people, that the vast majority of people in the church are lay people. They're the laity. They're you and me. Well, not the Pope, but he says they start, but that call to the lay vocation, which starts in baptism, is simply an expression of charity, and it typically starts within the family. The family, again, is that foundation of society. So it is from here, then, that charity is first directed and gains its initial strength to then extend itself into the wider society. All civil engagement, all concern, all drive is rooted first and foremost in the family. It's where we form, first and foremost, those civil and political persons that we are. And that is, as a side note, that's why those societal and political issues that concern the welfare of the family are really of the greatest importance. So he says, and I'll let you know, this is number 168. In 168, he says, don't forget that lay vocation is directed above all to charity within the family and to societal and political charity. It's that concrete and faith-based commitment to the building of a new society. So young people are therefore capable. He says, you are absolutely capable of experiencing true love in marriage and the greatest of joys in family life. He says, real beauty is found. I'm just looking at the clock now. I see that I am a little over time, so I'm going to be wrapping this up soon. He says, young people are capable of experiencing true love in marriage and the greatest joys of family life. So he's trying to debunk some of the modern myths around beauty. He calls it a confusion between beauty and appearances. So what is real beauty? He says real beauty is found in what gives us meaning and worth. So obviously among these things are family and work. And he uses just another image that it's very endearing. He uses this image about, and I'll let you read it for yourselves. There's this beauty in the laborer who returns home grimy and unkempt. There's this beauty in the wife who's slightly disheveled. We had a good laugh together as a staff when we read this number because it was because it's just so endearing. It's a really beautiful image of the beauty that is present in that lifelong bond, that marriage, that communion of persons to which he's talking. So finally, what does this all mean for us in ministry? The ministry towards and with young adults should be coordinated and integrated with the pastoral care of families. But first, families need to be cared for specifically and intentionally. And by this, I mean that that pastoral care to families does need to be improved and better prioritized at the diocesan and parish levels. Now, currently, across the national landscape of pastoral work at the diocesan and parish levels, there is definitely a lot more investment and resources for youth and young adult ministry. It's just a fact. Take any parish, and chances are there's a youth minister, whether that's volunteer or paid. But does that same parish have a family life minister who is specifically concerned with the well-being of the parish families? Most likely not. And this is not necessarily because there's no desire or interest. It's simply because a specific designated family life minister was not seen as necessary. But it is now, because the parish is that family of families, whether they're broken families, mixed families, young and old families, intercultural families, interreligious, ecumenical. So family ministry is tough. And compared to other ministries, it may be the hardest and the most complex. And just to name a few reasons before I wrap up. Because family is everything, of all types and compositions. Like I mentioned, mixed, intercultural, interreligious. Family is everyone. It's the parents, it's the siblings, it's the stepkids, it's the half-brothers and sisters, it's the extended relatives who are of all different ages and sizes and stages in life. And finally, families everywhere. The parish is a family of families, and without families, you just don't have a parish. So in a sense, everyone at the parish is serving families. So to conclude, I just have a few suggestions. And it doesn't matter if you are youth and young adult minister, if you're a marriage and family life minister, that's what the MFL stands for. If you're a DRE, a director of religious education, or a catechist, or simply a parent. First of all, I would just suggest this. One, get to know the family of the young people, whether they are your students, whether they are children next door, but especially if they're the people that you're ministering to in the parish. Ask questions to get to know the background of the family situation. Better yet, invite all the families to an evening together so that they can get to know one another. Number two, get the conversation started about what family means to young people, to your students, to the youth in your young group. Whether that's past, present, and future, what does that family mean? What does it mean to them now? What does it mean to them in the future? Do they aspire to having a family of their own? What will it look like? How will it start? How are they going to make that happen and when? And three, get intentional about coordination and collaboration with parish staff, everyone at the parish. So talk about how can you support each other's mission? Where are there areas of overlap and cooperation? And finally, if you are a parent, I could give another webinar because there's so much on to parents that can be sifted from this document. There really is a lot that parents could take away from this document. That's not necessarily directed to them specifically, but does have a lot more for them to think about. So feel free to also share in the Q&A if you have more concrete suggestions about how youth and young adults in marriage and family life can be better coordinated and cooperate for the greater glory of God, for the building up of our families from whom these young people come. And Erin, I believe that wraps up my part.
Thank you so much, Julia. We really appreciate all of your thoughts and sharing your real passion and knowledge of this document. I encourage everyone, and can you hear me okay, Julia?
I can.
Okay, great. We encourage anyone now to submit a question for Julia. I was interested in the last part of your presentation about a family life ministry. As I think about my own parish, I do not believe we have such a ministry.
Mm-hmm.
Just maybe, I'm sure they're all different depending upon the parish and where it's located, but what are some of the things that a family life minister do in a parish?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, Erin. I realize, like I said, that not many parishes have these family life ministers or someone to the equivalent title, sorry. But what a family life minister can do specifically is basically, I'll just give you broad strokes. Well, actually, in broad strokes, it's kind of what I just said. Number one, get to know the families in your parish. It's the family life minister really is that point person who gets to know the families in the parish, knows their needs, knows who they are, and what they're really at the parish for, whether that's for the sacraments, whether that's for catechesis, further catechesis, I mean, not just sacramental preparation, whether that's for whether that's simply because they are Catholics and they've gone through all of the sacraments, but they need to be, they're there for and with Christ, and they need to experience build that relationship further. So first and foremost, what a family life minister would do is know the families and support the clergy in knowing those families. I think oftentimes the clergy don't have the opportunity to get to know the people that they are serving. So a marriage and family life minister is really that liaison, can be a liaison between the parish priest, the deacon, the clergy, and the people whom he's serving. So that's kind of a first step. There's a multitude of other things that the marriage and family life minister can do, but another small thing that a marriage and family life minister can do is also help families recognize that they are first and foremost the church as well, and that the role of being a Catholic starts there in their own homes and in their own families, because they contribute therefore so much more to the parish if they are living a church life within the home first.
Are there any resources with the USCCB on this?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. On our website, which plans to be actually renewed soon, they say, there is a tab on the top which says who we are. And from there you can find our Secretariat for Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth. And then go through those pages. We have a lot on even the domestic church. You can use the search bar and find some other related articles on family life.
Okay, great, awesome. Well, this has been quite interesting and gives us all a lot to think about, even what are we doing in our own families, right, to be that domestic church and to help young people today. You mentioned the, identity crisis and how that leads to a crisis in one's vocation. So thank you so much, and usccb.org has a variety of resources that all of you can access. I'm sure most people already know that who are on the webinar today. Again, thank you, Julia, for sharing your time with us today. Those who are on or who have registered will receive an email tomorrow with a link to this recording so you can review it again or share it with those who would benefit. I'd also like to encourage all of you to join us on February 4th. Sarah Christmeyer is going to share the role of Scripture in forming really fruitful disciples in our parish. So thank you so much, everyone, for being with us today. Have a great day.
Thanks, Erin.
Thank you.